Hi, this is Captain Mike from Four Ribs Fishing, and today we're going to do some maintenance on the vapor separator tank for the Yamaha 4.2 liter V6. Stay tuned. Today we're going to be replacing the VST filters, and there's two for the 4.2 liter V6. Parts number 63P13915 and 6CB2450101. To get at the filters, we're going to need a bunch of different gaskets, and you can see them all laid out here. The first two we're going to find are behind the intake manifold. And this will be on the forward side of the motor. It's 6CB13646. And this will be on the back side of the motor, 6CB13645. The filter at the top of the tank is going to have a cover on it that has an O-ring that looks like this. And that is 6CB13016. The tank itself, the lid of the tank has a big oval O-ring. And its part number is 6CB14984. Back side of the tank has a gasket 6CB24482. Back side of the tank has an O-ring 6CB14239. The tools you're going to need to service your vapor separator tanks are as follows. I always like to have my shop manual for my particular motor. And again, I'll be working on the 4.2 liter V6 from Yamaha, the 300 horsepower model. I always say bag and tag your hardware. The Yamaha parts come in these really nice bags that are that have a Ziploc feature. They have a paper label on them that you can actually write on. So just use these. Sharpie, obviously. You're going to need a couple zip ties for the water lines on the back of the tank. You're going to need some thread locker for some of the hardware. The inside of the cooling tank, or the cooling fins inside of the tank, are going to be cruddy. You're going to want, this is a stiff plastic brush that I was using to clean that out with. I was also using this dental pick and compressed air. I also use this dental pick to dig out a lot of the O-rings, and you'll see that on the video. This is a magnet for fishing out hardware. On the intake manifold, there's a couple that are deep in there. You kind of want to stick that in the hole and pull out the hardware. Screwdrivers, you need a straight slot, you need a number 4 Phillips, you need a number 2 Phillips. This is a machinist ruler. It's just a very exact ruler. If you're going to check your needle and the float height inside the tank, you would need something like this, or calipers would work as well. From pliers, we have needle nose, we have a regular pair of pliers, have a pair of cutters. This is a cotter pin removal tool, one of my favorite tools, along with the dental pick. I use this to separate the hose clamps that Yamaha has. They have these hose clamps that have teeth going in two different directions, and I put this under the one tab, and with my other thumb I can just kind of open it up. It's good for those ones that are hard to reach. If it's right out in the open, you don't need anything like this. But this is a trim removal tool, like an interior trim removal tool. I like this sometimes to get some of the small 3/8" hoses off of their barbs. This slides right in there in between the hose, and you can work it up without putting a pair of pliers on the hose and kind of damaging the hose a little bit. Sockets and ratchets. At very least, you're going to need a 7, a 10, a 12, a few different extensions. If you're someone that cares about OEM torque values, you're going to need a torque wrench that goes down to 8 foot-pounds, and then a 10 and a 12 millimeter socket to match that package. I have a small impact gun here. I take hits all the time online for people giving me grief about using one of these. I use it to remove hardware. I would never apply torque on the motors with one of these. All right, this is a pressure and vacuum tool. If you're going to, there's a check valve inside the VST. If you're going to check that to see if it's working, you're going to want one of these, and you're going to need to adapt it. I think this is 5/8 inch line. You're going to need to adapt it because that pressure, the check valve is kind of wide. Optional if you want to do that or not. Paper towels, because you are going to spill some gas. You're also going to need a gas can to dump the gas out in. And I think that's about it. All right, I'm on the port side of the 4.2 liter V6. And the first step at getting to the VST tank, which is behind this intake manifold, is to remove this intake manifold. We have 4 bolts here on this side that require a 12mm socket. Then we have, let's see, then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts on this side that require a 10mm. So let's get right to it. On the rear of the intake manifold, we have the wiring harness for the fuel injectors, and there's a couple of clips holding that wire harness on. And I'm just going to use this cotter pin removal tool to separate the teeth on those clips and get that wire out of there. Oh, one more on the top. Now our intake manifold should be loose and ready to come out. Oh. And I have one more clip on the bottom. I'll try to give you a close-up of what I'm doing with this cotter pin removal tool. And you could do this with a screwdriver too. All I'm doing is getting in here and separating those teeth. And when you do that, this whole thing wants to come open. Okay, there's two electrical connections that we have to undo, and they are a thumb press, finger press and pull. And where do I put my thumb on this one? Squeeze on this side. Come on. Sometimes you gotta wiggle them a little. Okay. These couplers have different ends on them and can only be mounted to one place. So you can mark them if you wish, but there's really no need to. The video of the hose removal didn't turn out so great, so I'm just going to use this still and walk you through it. Do yourself a favor and take some detailed pictures. There's, I think, 4 or 5 hoses that need to be disconnected and need to go back in the proper spots. You'll need a pair of pliers to remove the clamps from these 2 fuel hoses at the top of the tank. The gray and the black line near the top of the tank are just press-ons. Sometimes I like to use a trim removal tool to help get these started. Okay, we're going to drain the VST tank before we remove it because it's mostly filled with fuel. So here I have the drain line running to a little fuel tank here, and I've removed every hose off the top of the tank. This fuel inlet, this gray one, this black one, and even this black vacuum line from the back. Once you do that, you could use a number 4 screwdriver and loosen the drain screw. You'll get a bunch of it out, but you won't get every last drop out. So give that a little while to drain and go do something else. The rest of the hoses are on the back of the tank, so we're going to have to loosen that first. Okay, the tank is loose, but you'll see that the pump is attached to it, and we're not going to do anything with the pump. So I'm going to remove these 2 bolts that are holding it on. I suspect it's number 10. Whoops. Okay. And just get working these hoses around the tank. There's 2 water lines on the back of the tank that are held on with zip ties. Cut the ties off. You'll have to put new ones on when you reinstall. You'll need a pair of pliers to remove the clamp for this fuel line. Okay, here I have the tank on the bench, and I'm removing 3 Phillips head screws off of the cooling reservoir in the back, and you'll need a number 2 Phillips. Yeah, look at that. Got some goop. All right, so here is the back gasket. Here is the old O-ring. And look at this buildup in here. Let me give you a close-up. This is disgusting. I wash my motor out religiously. Look at the buildup in this cooling area. Once the cooling reservoir is completely cleaned, I'm replacing the O-ring, I'm replacing the gasket, and then putting the cover plate back on. When I took those screws off originally, they had Loctite on them, so I'm replacing the Loctite. The manual doesn't specify a torque setting for these 3 screws, but rest assured you don't want this leaking when you put it back into your motor. Use a 4mm socket to remove these 3 bolts off of this top cover plate, and we'll expose the first filter that we're going to change. Okay, there's our cover. Wipe that off. Okay, we have an O-ring that we're replacing. We have a filter that we are replacing, which doesn't look that bad. And there's a check valve in here that we can test. To remove that, you're going to use your needle nose pliers. Put 1/2 of it on the inside, 1/2 of it on the outside. And very carefully just twist and pull up. It's on an O-ring, so your action there is twisting and just pulling a little bit. Somehow I lost the footage of me using the pressure tool to do this, and here I'm just showing that the directionality of fuel flow through the check valve. And if you apply pressure on this side, the check valve will stop you. If you apply pressure on the other side, it'll let air go through. Reinstall the check valve, making sure to seat the O-ring, and then put a new O-ring gasket on the housing. Insert your new filter, and then put the cover plate back on. These bolts are going to go to 1.5 foot-pounds, which is very little, so just be careful not to break them. 6 Phillips head screws hold on the top cover. Use a number 2 Phillips and take them all out. Then you could remove the old O-ring. You're going to have to replace it. All right, the filter that we're replacing, under this pump, we need a straight slot screwdriver. And we're just going to go around the edge. I'm going to lift up. There's a metal band on the mounting flange to keep it tight on there. And you'll see that on the pump or on the filter. You can get under that as well and pry up a little bit. Try to do it evenly. And she'll come off. There you go. Here's a close-up of the filter. It's a little dark. It's dark compared to the new one, but I don't think it's clogged at all. The new filter is going to go on. Replace the old one, just press down to seat it, and that's good. The factory float height calls for 2.66 of an inch, which is a little more than 2 5/8, and I'm well within spec here. Want to make sure we don't pinch this, that it's seated in the groove properly before we drop the pump on. Now the pump has this filter on the bottom of the pump, falls into a little rubber grommet on the bottom of the tank to hold it in place. So on your way down, just go slowly. And if it's not seating, it's because it's not in that little groove yet. All right. And you could get it down to no gap, then it's in the groove properly. We'll get a couple of these screws in it just to hold it. All right, using your number 2 Phillips, tighten up these 6 screws. Try to go in a zigzag pattern, applying a little bit more torque. The factory specs are only for 1.5 foot-pounds, so you know it's not all that much, but you absolutely don't want this to leak. This is gasoline inside here. Okay, here I'm positioning the tank where it wants to be, and then you can see I'm rotating it outward, and that's so I can get access to the hoses on the back. And the first one we're going to do is the water line on the bottom, and that requires a zip tie to reattach. And then lastly, there's a fuel line on the forward portion. You'll need your pliers to open that clamp and insert that hose back on. Okay, place the tank in its regular position, then rotate it out from the rear to get at that last water line. And you'll need a zip tie to secure that. Reinstall the vacuum line on the top of the tank just by sliding it over the barb, and then reinstall the fuel line on the front portion of the tank using your pliers to secure the clamp. This last black vacuum hose routes between the gray hose and the black fuel line on the top of the tank around to the back of the tank and slide it on the barb. Before we bolt the tank back to the block, we want to make sure all of our lines are properly routed and aren't going to be pinched, and make sure all of your keeper clips are secured. Using a 10mm socket, tighten the 4 bolts that hold the tank to the motor to 8.1 foot-pounds of torque. Align the low pressure fuel pump into its bracket and tighten the bolts to 8.1 foot-pounds with a 10mm socket. Reattach the 2 connections to the electrical harness. Remove the old gaskets from the intake and wipe down the surfaces. There's no front or back side to the gaskets, but there is an indexing tab which you need to align with a groove on the intake manifold. That's true for both gaskets. Just make sure that the tab's inserted and that the entire gasket is recessed into the groove of the intake manifold. There's going to be some hoses and some wires that you need to reposition a little bit in order to seat the intake manifold. Once you have it in its proper place, just insert all the bolts. Remember, the ones on the rear of the engine were the larger ones that use the 12mm socket, and the ones up front were the smaller ones that needed a 10. The intake manifold has a very specific 2-stage torque process. The first time around, you're going to tighten all the bolts in a specific sequence to 8.1 foot-pounds of torque. And then you're going to go through a second time torquing to the same 8.1 foot-pounds. The bolts in the rear have a similar 2-stage process, but those torque settings are 17.1 foot-pounds. So you go to 17.1 the first time and then 17.1 the second time. The last step is to reattach any of the wire harnesses into their clips. Don't forget the ones by the fuel injector wire harness, and you're basically done. Put the engine cover on and go give her a test. Hey, if you enjoyed this content, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel. Thank you, and tight lines.